What if I told you that once, in the hidden pages of history, there was a queen who gave birth to a child already dead, and slowly, painfully, began to rot while still breathing? This is not a tale of fantasy, not quite a legend, and never fully written into the books that bore the names of kings. It was a rumor. At first, a whisper from a forgotten corner of the French court, a name erased, a dynasty undone, and a scent, yes, a scent that arrived before the first scream. Tonight, you'll hear what was never meant to be remembered. You'll hear the story of Queen Jean, the last sovereign of the Valois line, whose body became a silent battleground for a curse so old its name was no longer spoken, and whose child born beneath locked doors, in the thick air of sealed chambers, would never take a breath, but would leave behind a presence that never truly died. So close your eyes now, let your breath slow, and prepare to step into a world where incense cannot cover the stench, and where not even a queen is safe from the rot. It began in the third hour of a nameless night. A castle guard, just one among many, was walking his usual path beneath the eastern vaults of Château Sandeni. His torch burned low. The halls were empty, but as he passed the sealed door of the Queen's chambers, he stopped, wrinkled his nose, and whispered something beneath his breath. It was the smell, he said, not the kind of scent you speak of in polite company. Not perfume, not smoke, but something older, wetter, and wrong, like meat left out too long in the summer sun. That was 40 minutes before the midwife came running down the hall, her eyes red with tears. She didn't dare explain. Her lips pressed shut like a prayer she had no faith in. She didn't speak. She simply passed, and behind her came the chaplain. His hands trembled as he walked, and in them, he held a swaddled bundle wrapped in black cloth. He carried it like a curse. It was not supposed to be like this. Queen Jean was only 4 months into her pregnancy. She had been kept in near-total isolation, barred windows, stuffed cracks, no breath of fresh air. The royal physician had left days earlier, summoned to treat a dying duke in Rouen. That left only old Ellen, a healer with no title and no legal right to touch royal blood, let alone deliver a royal child. But the child came anyway. No trumpet sounded, no cradle was prepared, and when the birth was over, there was no crying, only silence and the smell. Later, official records would say very little, just one line. In fact, the child was born without signs of life, but those who were there, those who still whispered in the corners of the palace, years later, they remembered. They said the child's skin was dark in patches, soft in places it should have been firm, that it stank the moment it emerged into the world, that the cloth it touched could never be washed clean, that even after burning, the swaddling gave off smoke that made the monks cough for hours. They sealed the birthing chamber, hammered shut the doors, scrubbed the stones with vinegar and prayers. But the scent remained, and so did the silence. The Queen survived. Physically, at least, but on the 6th day, she stopped speaking. She lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, her mouth moving in silence. At night, the servants heard her whispering not to them, but to something unseen, something she called a child, something she said had breath, even though it never had lungs. By the 7th day, spots began to bloom across her abdomen. By the 9th, her skin began to split. And by the time the physician returned from Rouen, the Queen's body was no longer her own. That is where we will leave you. For tonight, with the image of a mother staring into the darkness, her lips shaping names no one else can hear, her skin already beginning to betray her. In the weeks to come, we will follow the whispers that grew louder, the flesh that began to weep, and the priests who refused to speak her name. But for now, breathe easy. This is a story buried deep beneath layers of dust, hidden behind walls once lined with silk, and now covered in mold. And though the scent may linger, you are safe. You are only a visitor here, and no curse can follow you home. Let your eyes close gently. Let the room grow still, and sleep, knowing that history, no matter how dark, can only reach you if you choose to open the door again. Tomorrow, we'll return to it, and uncover what truly became of the queen who gave birth to rot. They would later say the child was born dead, that it never opened its eyes, that its chest never rose with breath. But those who had been near the queen's chamber that night, those who had heard the strange rustling behind the sealed wooden door, the frantic murmurs, the sounds of feet pacing in patterns that did not belong to any known ritual, remembered something else. They spoke of a silence that wasn't silence at all, but something tighter, like the breath held just before a scream. And in that stillness, something moved. The queen had labored alone. There were no bells, no physicians, no handmaids with lavender water and whispered encouragements. Her birthing chamber, in the eastern wing of Château Sandeni, had been sealed days earlier, its windows barred, its tapestries soaked with vinegar, and its air choked with incense, so thick it made the lungs ache to inhale. Her pregnancy, only 4 months along, had come with unease from the start. Her skin turned pale too quickly. Her dreams grew violent too often. And the palace cats, those ancient creatures that prowled the beams and rafters at night, refused to enter her rooms at all. The official explanation was illness. Of course, something delicate, something feminine. But the servants, as always, knew better. They heard the queen whispering into her pillows. They heard her refer to it before anyone had ever spoken aloud of a child. And they saw the midwife, Madame Helen, grow thinner by the day as she carried trays in, but never brought them back out. The queen, they said, was not merely pregnant. She was being consumed. It was on the night of the storm that the child came. Thunder broke above the eastern spires, and rain lashed against the leaded windows in sharp, angry sheets. The guards had taken shelter beneath the chapel arches, leaving the corridor outside the queen's room nearly empty. Only one watchman remained, an old man named Marceau, with joints too stiff to run and ears too dull to catch lies. He was the first to notice the smell. At first it was faint, like sour milk, or wet linens left too long in their wash. But soon it thickened, became metallic, became wrong. It seeped into the cracks of the stone, rose along the tapestries, and lodged itself in the throat, like a mouthful of cold copper. Marceau knocked once on the queen's door, but no one answered. He stepped back, and then he heard the cry. Not the cry of a newborn. That is too pure a sound to confuse. No, it was softer, wetter, a noise like something being pulled apart slowly, or breath exhaled through thick mucus. He turned away, crossed himself, and would not speak for the rest of the night. At dawn, the door opened. Madame Helen stepped into the hall barefoot, her gown stained to the knees, her hands trembling. She carried nothing. Behind her, the old chaplain appeared, his robes askew, his mouth set in a straight line of horror. He cradled something wrapped tightly in a length of black silk, its corners soaked through with dark blotches. He held it as one might carry a poisonous chalice, careful not to let it touch his skin. No blessing was uttered. No cradle was fetched. The bundle was taken straight to the furnace below the Abbey of Sainte-Geneviève and cast into the fire. Witnesses were forbidden. The ashes were buried deep beneath the northern cloister, where no one would ever pray. But the story did not end there. The chamber itself refused to be cleansed. The birthing bed, its mattress stripped and scrubbed twice with holy water, began to bleed through the linen as if the stains beneath the surface had never dried. The floorboards beneath the bed bowed and darkened. oozing something pale and sticky that the servants could not identify. Flies gathered at the window panes, even though the windows had not been opened in months. When the physician returned from Rouen 3 days later and entered the Queen's chamber, he claimed he could still see footprints in the wet beneath the bed, tiny, misshapen. And heading toward the wall, he ordered everything burned. The mattress, the sheets, the pillows, even the wooden frame itself dragged into the courtyard and set aflame beneath the noon sun. But as the fire crackled and the smoke rose, a strange thing occurred. The wind, which had been steady all morning, fell still, and the smoke, instead of rising, curled downward and pressed itself against the courtyard stones before disappearing into the cracks. By the 6th day, the Queen had not spoken. She lay on her side, unmoving, her eyes open but unfocused, her mouth occasionally forming words that no one could hear. When servants changed her linens, they said her skin had begun to blister, not with heat, but with moisture, as though something beneath the surface was pushing outward. Her abdomen, still swollen from birth, had not receded. In fact, it appeared to grow larger each day. When questioned, the midwife Helen would only say, "It left something behind." And then, on the 7th night, the Queen began to whisper. It was not prayer. It was not mourning. It was a lullaby. A lullaby no one recognized. One that named no saints and sang no virtue. It was tuneless, slow, and punctuated by the sound of something wet moving beneath the bedsheets. The nurses were replaced. The chamber doors were resealed. The tapestries were burned and replaced with plain cloth. The windows were locked. The incense increased, and the Queen was declared in recovery. But behind the locked doors, the whispers continued, and in the city below, the dreams began. Young girls in the town of Sandeni reported waking with blood on their hands. One nun at the abbey collapsed during Mass, claiming she heard a child breathing beneath the altar. A servant who had been dismissed from the Queen's chambers was found days later in the woods outside the city, her hands buried in the mud, her eyes wide and unblinking, repeating the same phrase over and over. It came out wrong. It came out wrong. The court, of course, issued no statement. Foreign envoys were told the Queen had suffered a difficult labour, that her recovery would be long but assured, and that the child had, tragically, not survived. But in the palace itself, no one believed that the matter had ended. A monk assigned to light candles outside the Queen's rooms swore that when he passed her door at dusk, he heard 2 sets of breathing, one shallow and fast, the other low and laboured. When he placed his ear to the wood, he heard the faintest sound, like something being dragged across stone. He never returned to that hall again. And in the weeks that followed, something changed in the Queen's skin. It grew translucent in places, like overripe fruit. Her hair began to fall out in long, dry strands. Her lips cracked. Her fingertips split. The stench grew worse, no longer sharp like infection, but heavy and sweet, like rot. And still, she whispered lullabies to something no one could see. When the physician tried to examine her abdomen, she screamed, for the first time in weeks, the ragged cry that made the guards outside the door grip their swords without knowing why. He would later write that beneath her skin, he saw movement, a ripple, a twist, something alive, but he could not explain it, because the child was never supposed to breathe, and yet, some said it did. Not with lungs, not with voice, but with presence, and that presence remained not in the cradle, but in her. There is a kind of silence that no cathedral can match. It does not hum with reverence or shimmer with light. It does not echo with holy footsteps or the rustle of silk robes in prayer. No, this silence is heavier, Denser, a silence that presses against the walls of a room like wet cloth. A silence that suffocates sound before it's ever made. And in the Queen's chambers, after the birth, it settled thickly, wrapped around her body like a second skin, clung to her tongue, to the folds of her sheets, to the air itself, as if something there had grown weary of human noise and decided to bury it. She no longer moved, not in the way a human being is expected to. There were moments, of course, when her eyes would open without blinking, long enough for a nurse to wonder if she'd woken, long enough for a novice monk to whisper the beginnings of a prayer, before realizing the Queen was not looking at him, but through him, as though something far older and colder was peering out from behind her face, watching not the world, but the walls. Her mouth no longer formed words that anyone could understand, but it moved. At night, slowly, rhythmically, sometimes shaping a word that might have been child, sometimes curling as though she were mimicking the act of feeding, sometimes simply twitching as though her own lips no longer obeyed her, and were now being pulled by something beneath. On the 12th night after the birth, the first lesions appeared, not upon the child. The child had long since been burned, or so they told each other, although none who touched that bundle had lived long enough to speak freely. No, the wounds belonged to her, the Queen. They began on her lower abdomen, not red or swollen as one might expect from infection, but black and flat, like pressed rot. The edges raised and crusted with a texture no one could name. At first they were circular, then they spread, not just across her stomach, but inward, upward, toward the ribcage. As if following a map, one nurse fainted while changing her bandages, claiming she saw something beneath the skin shift, like a ripple in water, or a worm swimming just below the surface of a bog. Another, barely 15, returned to the convent with both palms burned red. She had, it turned out, used vinegar-soaked cloth to clean the Queen's side, and when she lifted it, some fluid from the open wound had touched her bare hand. She said it felt like oil, but burned like lime. She would never enter the eastern wing again. And still the Queen did not die. She was fed through broth, pressed between her lips. Her limbs remained slack, but not stiff. Her torso swelled with slow, sick pressure. She did not bleed. Not anymore. There was no blood left to flow. What leaked from her now was something else. A translucent, foul-smelling mixture of mucus and something darker. Something congealed. Something that did not run, but oozed. The servants changed her sheets twice daily, burning each set after use. Yet still the smell persisted, sweet and clinging. The kind that coats the roof of your mouth and lingers long after breath is held. The royal physician, finally returned from his other duties, made the sign of the cross before every examination. He began wearing gloves soaked in wine and frankincense. He spoke little, but one night, in the cloisters, after 2 full chalices of sacramental wine, he whispered to a younger clerk that her body is no longer obeying death. He said the tissues around her lower belly had softened like wax left too close to flame, and that when he pressed gently upon the bruised skin near her hip, his fingers sank. Not far, but far enough to know that what lay beneath was not clot, not bruise, not fluid, but space. Empty, rotting space. When the Archbishop was informed, he forbade all further surgical probing. He declared the Queen's body sacred, and her suffering holy, and that no blade would pierce her unless accompanied by the rites of purification. Even as the flesh peeled from her inner thighs, even as the ulcers bloomed behind her knees, even as her fingertips darkened and cracked like tree bark in a long drought. No blade, only prayers. So they brought incense. They brought monks from Toulouse, trained in chanting over the dead to drive out corruption. They painted ash crosses on the walls, lit candles along every corner of the room, whispered the psalms in voices that trembled, and held vials of holy oil that turned black before the first verse was finished. No one dared to touch her skin anymore. Not directly. She was wiped lightly, softly with soaked linens, folded thrice and changed each time they touched a lesion. The room was kept dim, her body hidden beneath layers of coarse linen, always damp, always faintly moving as if something inside her refused to settle. The only light allowed came from a single lantern, its flame so small and flickering that it barely illuminated the corners. Yet in that dim glow, one monk would later confess, she looked less like a queen and more like something forgotten in a crypt. It was around this time that the whispers returned not from her, but about her. The guards refused to serve more than one night at a time. A valet scratched at his own neck until his skin bled and was found curled beneath a stairwell, muttering. She opened her eyes when I thought she was asleep. The midwife, Madame Helen, fled the palace entirely, her belongings left behind, her name erased from the registry. One novice claimed he saw her in the woods beyond the abbey, barefoot and weeping, holding something small in her hands and kissing it over and over before dropping it into a stream. None pursued her. None wished to know what she had carried. Soon after, a new girl arrived from the convent. She was young, quiet, unwilling, rumored to have been sent not for healing, but to take the place of one already lost. She did not speak. She did not look anyone in the eye. And when she entered the Queen's chamber, she left her shoes behind, walking barefoot across the cold stone as if to feel every vibration that might rise from beneath. 3 days passed, and then another nurse collapsed. This time it was not from fear, or stench, or illness. It was from something she saw. She would not describe it clearly, only that the Queen had shifted, not turned, not rolled, but shifted, that her flesh folded, that the wound along her side had moved in a way that flesh should not move, that something beneath had pressed outward against the gauze, not in panic, not in pain, but as if curious, as if testing the boundaries. The next morning, the physician found one of the Queen's bandages tossed onto the floor, stiff with dried fluid, and bearing something new, a print, not of a hand, not kite, something smaller, boneless, webbed at the edges, and yet distinct. He did not speak of it again, but he never touched her after that. By the time the first scream was heard, most had already stopped listening. The eastern wing had been declared a place of silence, not in name, not by decree, but in practice. Conversations hushed when its halls were mentioned. Servants took longer routes to avoid walking near it. Monks began praying in other corridors. Guards who were assigned to post outside the Queen's chamber lasted no more than a single night. And those who returned did so changed not outwardly, not in visible disfigurement, but in something behind the eyes, something hollowed, as though whatever they had seen had carved a silence into them that no amount of sleep or sunlight could ever fill. The doors to the Queen's chamber remained closed, locked by 3 iron bolts and a wooden bar. The hinges had been reinforced, the key guarded by the Archbishop himself, and all cloth near the entrance soaked in vinegar and poppy broth, in an attempt to dull the stench that seeped constantly from within. But none of it mattered, because the rot was no longer just in the flesh. It had begun to take root in the walls. At night, the stones wept. Not water, not dew, but something thicker, pale yellow in colour, with a texture that clung to the fingertips when touched and refused to dry, even after hours in the open air. Monks assigned to clean it began refusing the task. 2 fell ill with fevers that would not break. One lost all the skin from his fingertips. Another began screaming in his sleep short, breathless bursts as though someone were pressing a pillow to his face, though no one was ever in the room. And then came the sound It began not as a scream, but as a whisper. It started with the faint scraping of fabric, as though someone were shifting beneath bed sheets, followed by a wet rustle, a noise like silk dragged across damp stone, a quiet hiccup of breath that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal either. Then, on the 23rd night after the Queen's confinement, a guard posted at the far end of the hall reported hearing something new: footsteps. Not hurried, not heavy, just soft, deliberate steps, one after another, moving slowly back and forth across the floor of the Queen's chamber, punctuated every so often by the creak of wood or the low thud of something wet being dropped. The guard knocked once on the door, his voice trembling as he called out the Queen's name, though by then no one used her name aloud anymore. There was no response. He knocked again, and that's when the scream came, not loud, not disperator, but sharp, like a blade drawn across a stone wall, high-pitched and dry, and laced with something that felt like laughter and anguish all at once. He stumbled back, dropped his torch, ran down the hall, and did not stop until he reached the chapel, where he collapsed, muttering prayers he hadn't spoken since he was a child. When asked what he had heard, he answered with only one phrase. She wasn't alone. The next morning, they tried to open the door. The Archbishop himself arrived, flanked by 2 monks, 3 guards, and the royal physician. They unbolted the locks, lifted the wooden bar, but when they pushed the door inward, it would not move. Something heavy was pressed against it from the other side. Though no one had entered the room in days, the physician called out, his voice shaking, the first syllable catching in his throat. There was no answer, only silence. And then a sound, liquid, thick and slow, as if something were being poured not from a cup, but from a wound. The guards recoiled. One dropped his sword. Another covered his mouth and turned away. They left the door closed. That night, the Archbishop ordered rituals to be performed. Sacred symbols were drawn on the wood. Psalms were read aloud. Candles were lit, but every candle extinguished itself before the final verse was spoken. The air grew colder. The floor beneath the Queen's door darkened with something that looked like soot, but smelled of decay. They could no longer deny it. Something inside that room was alive. And it was not just the Queen. They doubled the guard. 2 men posted at either end of the hall, rotated every 4 hours, armed, anointed, and instructed to speak no words aloud. But the guards lasted less than a week. One was found in the stables, with his face wrapped in cloth, his tongue bitten nearly in half. The other wandered the chapel barefoot, muttering to the altar, tearing pages from the psalter, and eating them until he choked on the binding. Neither could explain what they'd seen, but both agreed on one detail. The door moved. Not opened, not forced, but breathed, as if it pulsed in and out, very gently, with the rhythm of lungs that had no body, of breath that had no voice. It was no longer a question of whether something was in the room. The question now was what, inside. The Queen had not spoken for nearly a month, but her body had not stilled. Nurses, those few who remained, reported that her chest rose and fell at uneven intervals, that the lesions across her skin now peeled in strips, that her hair had fallen out in tangled clumps, leaving behind a scalp riddled with scabs and a faint, sour odor that seeped into the walls. Beneath her bed, the mattress had collapsed entirely, the frame splintered by what the physician described only as liquid erosion. Though no water had entered the room in weeks, her sheets were never dry, her lips never fully closed. Her eyes, when open, were clouded, yet still glistened when the lantern light touched them. One morning, a linen cloth used to clean her neck was found returned to the door, folded, neatly placed, but no one admitted to retrieving it. It was damp, and something had written on it. Not ink, not blood, but something grey, organic, streaked across the folds in patterns that no one could translate. The cloth was burned. The ashes were buried, but the pattern remained in the memory of those who saw it. They said it resembled roots, dendrils, or vines. By the 40th day, even the archbishop no longer entered her room. He left instructions to place clean wrappings outside her door, to change the incense every 3rd hour, to read no more prayers, only silence. The guards were withdrawn. The hallway was closed. A sign was nailed to the entrance of the eastern wing, bearing only 5 words: "Let no one knock here." But people still listened, and those who listened heard things. Footsteps at midnight, breathing without rhythm, knocking that came not from the outside, but from within. Once, a servant swore she heard a lullaby hummed, not sung low and slow, repeating the same 3 notes over and over until she could no longer tell if the sound was real or echo. And once, just once, the scream returned, this time louder, this time closer, not a woman's voice, not a child's either, something in between, high and broken and trembling with the sound of wet bones and old breath, and something pulling itself upward through flesh that no longer knew how to hold it. No one opened the door. No one tried. The next morning, something new appeared on the stone outside the chamber. A handprint, not painted, not drawn, impressed, pressed into the wall as if someone had pushed their palm against stone soft as wax, leaving behind not just a shape, but depth of full indentation, complete with finger creases and shallow nails. A hand smaller than a man's, but not quite child-sized, with webbing stretched between the digits. No one touched it. The wall around it was cleaned, but the print remained. Later, when the carpenter came to inspect the stone, he refused to enter, said the mark had sunk deeper than mortar should allow, said he could still feel warmth in the wall where no fire had ever burned. He left without finishing the report. He never returned to the palace again. And the queen remained, unmoving, unnamed, unburied, and still whispering, just behind the sealed doors, to something no longer swaddled in silk, but walking the floor. There is a moment in every place of power when the silence becomes too loud to ignore, when the shadows no longer stretch in rhythm with the sun, but begin to grow of their own accord, and when the walls, no matter how thick, no matter how sacred, seem to shift ever so slightly inward, as if to whisper to themselves that something has gone terribly wrong. In the eastern wing of Château Sandeni, that moment had long since passed. The door to the Queen's chamber was no longer just a boundary. It was a barrier, not to keep something out, but to keep something in. And still she breathed. Somehow, softly, inconsistently, sometimes after hours of stillness, her chest would lift, not with a gasp or a sigh, but with a slow inflation, as if air itself no longer entered her by choice, but was pushed into her by the force of whatever remained inside. Her body, once slender, regal, still in posture, even through the early months of confinement, had changed beyond recognition. Her arms had grown thin, but her midsection swelled in strange directions, not round like pregnancy, not bloated like illness, but warped, as though her bones had forgotten where they belonged, and the flesh had begun to shape itself around something that had not been born but had stayed. The rot had spread. It was not rot as physicians knew it, not necrosis that blackens and curls and consumes. This rot was quieter, patient. It flowered beneath the skin like mold blooming behind a wall, invisible, until the surface finally split and revealed a nest of soft collapse. The lesions around her thighs had deepened, losing their circular shape and forming long, jagged patterns like riverbeds seen from above. The ulcers that had once been small enough to cover with gauze now wept openly through her bedding. When the nuns changed her linens, they wore cloths over their mouths and doused their hands in ash. But even that was not enough to keep the scent away. It clung to the edges of their sleeves. It soaked into their hair. It coated the back of the throat and refused to leave. She no longer spoke. Not in words, but her mouth moved still. And when it did, the nurses said it was not like the movements of a woman dreaming or muttering. It was like the mouth was remembering how to form sounds it had never made. Sounds that did not belong to any language known in the kingdom. Her eyes were open more often than not. They did not blink. They did not look. They only stared. The pupils blown wide and unseeing. Except some said when the name of the devil was spoken. Then they constricted. Sharply. Like a creature reacting not to pain but to familiarity. The surgeon, brave or foolish, or perhaps simply desperate, petitioned the archbishop for permission to lance the largest of the wounds. He argued that the flesh would collapse if the pressure were not released, that the body might rupture, that the very air might turn foul from what fermented inside her. The archbishop refused. He said no blade would touch the sacred womb, that her suffering was penance for sins not yet named, that only the hand of God would decide what remained, and so she was left untouched, but not unmoved. Her sheets were changed, her body washed with vinegar and lye. But no one dried her. The cloths laid across her chest remained damp, and still the stains returned. Not red, not brown, not yellow, but a grey so deep it shimmered green at the edges, like old skin stretched too thin across bone. Then came the incident with the midwife, Helen, who had delivered the Queen's child, who had whispered the first prayer over its cold form, who had burned the swaddling with her own hands. She had not spoken since that night. Not in public, not in chapel, not even when asked directly by the Archbishop himself. But one evening, just after dusk, she was seen running from the Queen's chambers barefoot and breathless, her apron clutched in her hands, her face wet with something that was not sweat and did not smell of fear, but of something older, something spoiled. She screamed not in words, but in a series of gasps, sobs, convulsions that had no rhythm except panic. She spoke of the air dripping, of the sheets crawling, of a warmth that came from beneath the floorboards. And then she was gone. By morning, no trace of her remained. Some said she fled to the coast. Others claimed she walked into the woods and never came out. A few believed she was taken by whatever now moved beneath the Queen's skin. Her name was struck from the rolls. A silent novice was sent in her place, a girl from the convent with no tongue and no family, who slept, standing in the chapel with her hands folded into her sleeves. She entered the Queen's room without trembling, and when she left it, her eyes no longer blinked at all. The guards who remained outside the door began to grow sick. 3 developed rashes that could not be cured. 2 lost their hair in thick, unnatural clumps. 1 burned his own face with coals from the hearth and leapt into the monastery well, leaving behind only a fragment of cloth marked with a single line of blood. It watches from inside. The court tried to move on. Letters were sent abroad declaring the Queen in recovery. Edicts were signed by her name. Promises made that she would return to the balcony within 40 days. That she was regaining strength. That she was praying. That she was healing. But the doors remained shut, and the healers no longer entered. And inside that room, the rot continued. Furniture from her chamber was removed and burned, not because it smelled, but because it changed. The chairs softened, the wood warped, the legs bowed as if melted. The curtains grew damp, no matter how long they hung in the sun. The pillows bled moisture. 1 candle left beside her bed began to bend sideways, the wax drooping not with heat, but as though pulled by something beneath the mattress. The mattress itself dissolved. One morning, the Queen's body was found sunken nearly to the floor, the wood beneath her weeping black. Her garments clung to her skin not in folds, but in wet adhesions that tore when pulled. Her left thigh had opened entirely, not by blade, not by boil, but by a long crack that ran from hip to knee, and from within it, according to a monk who never returned to speak again, Something pulsed. Something white and soft. Not flesh, not bone, but something root-like, writhing without sound, curling gently like a blind finger searching for light. She was not moved. She could not be moved. The order was given to build a chamber. Within the chamber, a wooden box of consecrated timber, lined with ash and wrapped in scripture. Carpenters from Lyon were summoned, but refused to enter. They said no measure of pay could force them near a place where the walls seemed to sweat. 2 novices took their place. Young, silent, obedient. The box was built in 2 days. The queen was placed inside it. Still dressed, still dump, still breathing. A valet later confessed that as her body was lifted, 2 worms slid from her ear and vanished into the cracks of the floor. No one spoke her name. Not after that. Not ever again. There are kinds of curses that travel in blood, and others that cling to names, and others still that pass silently from breath to breath. Never written, never spoken, never even recognized until the silence in the room turns unnatural and the air presses in too close. But what haunted the eastern wing of Château Sandeni was older than language and more patient than grief. It was not content to rot within the body of a queen. It wanted more, and by the time the wooden chamber was sealed around her, it had already slipped through the cracks. The palace staff no longer called her Majesty, not even in whispers. There was no decree, no funeral, no tom, but her name vanished from official records and daily prayers alike. She became the one who lies, she who breathes without breath. The vessel in the timber, her presence persisted not in ceremony, not in voice, but in scent and sickness and something else, something unspoken that moved just beyond the reach of reason. Outside her chamber, the stench had grown worse. It slipped under doors, into storerooms and side corridors, and the cracks of old staircases, until even the wine cellars smelled faintly of vinegar and wet bark. The guards who remained grew pale. They rubbed salt into their sleeves and clove beneath their tongues. They stopped making eye contact. One was found in the stables with a crude cross burned into his chest, fingernails torn down to bleeding beds. He would not speak. He would not sleep. A note was found beneath his cot with a single line scribbled in black ink. There is someone whispering inside, and it is not her. They resealed the eastern wing, not just the Queen's chamber, but the entire corridor. 2 doors were locked. Then 5, then 15. Finally, a barrier was constructed across the main hall, a wall of timber and black cloth, marked with symbols from old rites, doused in wine and ash and laid with salt lines. The Archbishop declared the wing forbidden, not just to enter, not just to see, but to approach. The monks stopped leaving offerings at the Queen's door. Instead, they slid them to the edge of the barrier and turned away before the vinegar bowls touched the ground. And still, the rot spread. Illness crept into the palace, first among the guards, then the kitchen hands, then the laundresses. Fevers that did not break, ulcers that bubbled along the lower back, sores that burst and reformed with no sign of infection, as though the flesh itself no longer knew how to heal. The royal cook left without notice. 3 stable boys disappeared. The steward collapsed while reading the morning edicts. No one questioned it. No one tried to explain. They simply began to avoid the Queen's wing altogether, pretending it had never existed, even as the scent crept beneath chapel doors, and the candles refused to burn in rooms above the eastern vault. Then came the Mass. In a final act of defiance, or perhaps desperation, the Archbishop held a full consecration of the palace. Priests were summoned. Psalms were chanted. Every wall anointed. Every hall walked barefoot in procession. But even then, even in the high hours of holy ritual, the eastern wing resisted. The incense burners snuffed themselves out. The candles refused to light. One nun, Sister Agatha, stepped forward during the third day of prayer. Her hands folded in front of her, her eyes wet but steady. She whispered something to the Archbishop. He turned pale. She left the monastery that same hour and was never seen again. He would later write in his private letter, she said, "The curse will not leave, that it has already gone forth." Within a week, infants began to die in the city. Not all at once, not in crowds, just one by one. Quietly, some were born still, with blackened skin. Others had no mouths. One, according to a midwife in the Saint Michel quarter, came into the world with no eyes, just hollow pits beneath the brow. The body vanished within a day. 2 priests in black robes had come to bless the child and taken it away, saying nothing, leaving only ash in the hearth and a dead crow nailed to the lintel. These deaths never reached the royal record, but in the margins of a minor chronicle from the Abbey of San Rami, someone had written one sentence in red ink. The curse that began in the blood of the stillborn bloomed in the mother's flesh and scattered across the land. Inside the sealed chamber, the queen had not moved in weeks. She did not eat. She did not speak. She did not blink. But the wooden box in which she lay had begun to leak. Black liquid, slow and warm, seeped from beneath the doorframe, pooling on the stone floor like spilled ink. One carpenter, Pierre Rage, attempted to wipe it with a cloth. The moment he touched it, the rag began to smoke. He dropped it with a cry, clutching his hand as the flesh beneath his fingers turned red and bubbled, as if it had been scalded by oil. He was carried away screaming. His cries were heard echoing from the north tower that night. He would never return to the wing again. A second barrier was built. Gates. This time, metal and ash wood. Then another. Then the decision came. A secret order. Signed, not with a seal but a silence. The queen was to be declared dead. Quietly. Privately. Without proclamation. No funeral. No procession. Only an agreement. That her name would be struck from record. That the wing would be burned. That what remained of her would be given to God. And forgotten by men. But power does not vanish so easily. And when something once wore a crown, it leaves a trace. The night before the burning, a feast was held for the nobles who remained, not in celebration, not in mourning, but in something that lay between heavy wine, meat gone just slightly grey at the edges, and a silence that filled the gaps between clinking silverware like a second presence at the table. No one toasted, no one laughed, no one spoke her name. In the early hours before dawn, a final meeting was held. The Chancellor, the Archbishop, the Captain of the Guard, 3 Duke. They gathered in the northern chapel. No one else was allowed in. The statement was read aloud. She can no longer be named bearer of the crown. Her body is sealed, her spirit cast out, yet the trace remains. Divide the inheritance by blood. Erase her memory. Destroy the wing. There was no signature, no official stamp. But when morning came, oil was poured across the base of the eastern wing. It soaked into the floorboards, ran up the walls, was brushed across the beams and doorposts, and support arches, and vaulted ribs. The central pillar was lit first. Witnesses said the flames moved like animals, not upward, but inward. The fire burned for 5 hours. It did not spread. It did not leap to other wings. It curled back on itself, hungrily, twisting through the corridors, licking the walls, swallowing each sealed door in silence. And when it reached the chamber at the heart of the wing, a sound was heard. Not a scream, not a cry, not even a voice, but something between sound and breath and tremble, as though the air itself were exhaling something it had held too long. The flames died with the sunset. The walls collapsed. Only the stone foundation remained, and at its center, a black mark. Where the chamber had stood, Even after the flames had starved themselves to ash, and the smoke had withdrawn from the skies above Château Sandeni, the silence did not lift. The eastern wing was gone, but its memory did not die with the fire. It lingered, not in voices or relics or any remaining scrap of cloth, but in the air, in the stone, and in the minds of those who had seen what stood behind that final sealed door. The queen had been erased, but she had not been forgotten, and what had once lived inside her had not been buried in the blackened mark on the palace floor. It had moved on. There were no funerals. There was no tomb. Her body was never recovered. There was, instead, a decree unsigned, unwitnessed, and placed in no official archive that named her departure only as the surrender to the Lord in the time of silence and shadow. Her crypt in the royal vault was left empty. Her crest was scraped from the palace walls. The coins bearing her face were melted and reforged, and when foreign dignitaries inquired, they were told only that the throne was in transition, that the queen had entered retreat, that the council would govern until a rightful heir appeared. But within the court, no one believed she had retreated. They believed she had become something no longer fit for earth or memory. Those who had touched her fate, those who had sat in meetings behind closed doors or stood too long near the sealed walls, began to vanish. The archbishop retired within the month. His skin bloomed with ulcers that would not heal. His final words, mumbled feverishly from a bed soaked with antiseptic and wine, were, "She was not alone." The Duke of Anjou disappeared en route to Lyon. His carriage found empty by the roadside with one wheel still spinning. Count René, once the heir apparent, died of poisoning that no physician could trace. His tongue blackened, but his veins remained pale. The poison was never found. In the streets, whispers grew like mold in the wake of the fire. They said the queen had not died. They said the body was never meant to rot, only to open. That she had not screamed in her final hour but laughed. That the sound heard beneath the flame was not death, but birth. That something crawled from her during the final collapse and escaped into the earth beneath the palace. And that the palace knew. The stone floors beneath the eastern wing remained dark, even after they were scrubbed with ash and salt. The scorch marks refused to fade. A thin black film appeared whenever it rained. The spot was paved over with fresh stone and bordered with new bricks, but none would walk across it. No pigeons nested nearby. No grass grew within 10 feet of the foundation. The new architects drew up plans for a ballroom to replace the lost wing. But each time the builders began excavation, the tools rusted within hours, and the wood split down the grain. Eventually, the space was left untouched. A garden was planted, but no tree took root. No flower lasted more than a day. The court gave it a name, La Terre Morte, the dead land. The Queen's name was never spoken again in session. All documents referring to her reign were rewritten. All portraits were destroyed. All who remembered her were instructed to forget. But forgetting, it turned out, was impossible, because the silence she left behind was not empty. It was full, and it spread. The Abbey of St. Bernard, once tasked with performing monthly rites in her name, began holding daily cleansings. Not in her honor, but in defense against something else. Something that had begun to manifest in the dreams of the novices, dreams of a woman without skin, two of black cloth dripping through the ceiling beams, of a heartbeat that shook the chapel floor even when no one was kneeling. In the countryside, children were born with strange marks, some with slits along their backs, some with thin, translucent webbing between their fingers. One child, whose mother had served in the Queen's kitchen, emerged with no tongue, no eyelids, and skin that sloughed away at the slightest touch. The midwife died 3 days later from wounds. No one saw. Villagers near the capital began reporting strange fogs low, thick, and silent that moved not with the wind but with intent. Entire barns were found collapsed with animals bloated and stretched as though something had pushed out from within. In one such case, A stable hand was discovered lying face down in hay, whispering a lullaby no one had taught him. He did not recognize the words, but they matched the sounds once heard behind the Queen's door. In secret meetings, the remaining council members debated what to do. Some argued for mass exorcism. Others suggested demolishing the entire palace. A few claimed it was too late, that the moment had passed, and that whatever had been confined was now free, that it had no need for a body anymore, that the curse had walked out the gate not with feet, but with breath and silence, and had entered the city like mist. Even the city maps changed. The eastern wing was no longer marked. The garden bore no name, and on the new engravings distributed to foreign courts, a simple hedge was shown where the Queen's quarters once stood. But the builders knew. They refused to cut stone within 30 feet of the site. They refused to work after dusk. One mason left his chisel lodged in the earth when he struck a vein of black beneath the surface. The ground hissed. The metal curled. He lost all the skin from his fingers. The silence that spread from the Queen's chamber was not merely the absence of voice. It was a suffocation of memory. A slow erasure. A decay that did not stop with the body. It entered speech. It entered records. It entered thought. And those who resisted those who tried to remember were the ones who suffered most. Because remembering meant inviting it back in. Because memory, like flesh, could be corrupted, and the curse knew how to wait, and walk, and whisper, even when no one was listening, even when the wing had burned, even when the name had been forgotten, because some things, once born, never truly die, and not all children are buried. Some are carried forward in silence. Fire has long been thought the purest tool of forgetting. It consumes names, devours objects, blackens paper, breaks bones into ash and heat. In the hands of kings, fire was justice. In the hands of priests, fire was mercy. And in the hands of desperate men who feared what they could not name, fire was the last argument against the unnatural. But there are some things, some lives, some deaths, some horrors so deeply etched into the fabric of a place that no flame, no matter how holy or hot, can unwrite them. That was the lesson learned the night the eastern wing of Château Sandeni was set alight. The decision had not come easily. The Queen's fate had never been officially sealed, her death never declared, her name never laid to rest in the words of any state document. To burn the wing would be to confirm what everyone already feared, that she was no longer alive, but not quite dead, that she had become something else, something that needed to be contained, erased, sealed in flame, not to mourn, but to silence. The fire was planned in the early hours. As the city slept, and the mist hung low across the palace walls, oil was drawn from deep stores, salt was scattered across the stones, prayers were whispered not in hope, but in trembling habit, by lips already preparing to forget what they were blessing. The men who lit the torches were not soldiers. They were scribes, priests, craftsmen, quiet men, tired men, men who had stood too close to too many sealed doors. They did not look each other in the eyes. They poured the oil in silence. Along the baseboards, across the doorways, up the beams and pillars and carved archways of the eastern wing, they coated the corridor floor, the cracked stone leading to the Queen's last chamber, and circled the wooden box where she had once been laid, never opened, never removed. They lit the central pillar first, and waited. At first, the fire behaved as all fire does. It crackled, consumed, curled upward in spirals of orange and gold. The shadows danced along the plaster. The carvings of saints split and flaked. The paint blistered. The wooden beams groaned. But then the fire began to change. Witnesses would later swear the flames did not rise, but turned inward, drawing themselves into the walls rather than upon them. Instead of leaping from one surface to another, the fire moved in long, slow arcs, as if it were following something searching through the corridors, sniffing out hidden cracks, peeling away centuries of stone, not in hunger, but in curiosity. They said it moved with awareness. They said it chose where to burn. And when it reached the door of the Queen's chamber, what had once been her chamber, what had long since been turned into a wooden tomb, the fire did not roar. It paused for one long moment. The flames flickered low, and the air grew still, as though the entire eastern wing had taken a breath. And then the scream came. Not loud, not shrill, not human. Something deeper, older. A sound that did not emerge from the mouth, but from the bones beneath. A vibration that pressed against the ribs and rattled the dust from the corners of the chapel 3 floors away. It was not a cry of pain. It was not a cry of fear. It was not a cry at all, but a kind of utterance, like something long asleep had been disturbed, had been unwrapped, had seen the light of fire, and found it wanting. The doors split, not from heat, but from within, and the fire rushed in. It filled the room, coiling through the space where no one had walked in months, winding around the wooden box like a lover returned from war. The black cloth draped across the beams ignited in a flash of blue. The bed, though long since dissolved, erupted in a gout of smoke that smelled of myrrh and rot. The lantern, left burning for days without wick, shattered in a hiss of steam, and from beneath the floorboards, something popped soft, wet, like fruit left too long in the sun. Outside, no one spoke. The flames rose behind the stained glass windows, turning the saints into shadows. The roof collapsed. The ceiling groaned like a throat clearing itself. And then the fire pulled back, withdrawing from the corners, shrinking down to a core. It did not vanish. It did not die. It settled, and when dawn came, the wing was gone. The eastern corridor was reduced to bone. The walls had fallen. The tapestries were ash. The stone floor was cracked and blackened in the shape of a cradle curved at the top, pinched at the bottom, stained through with something that no priest would dare touch. The black mark was not soot. It would not brush away. It did not flake. It seemed to sink deeper with every passing hour, as if the ground itself was absorbing what had once lain there. They tried to rebuild. Of course they did. Walls were sketched, bricks ordered, builders summoned, but each time work began, something went wrong. A mason's hand swelled and split. A scaffolding collapsed with no wind. A foundation poured at dawn was cracked by noon, despite clear skies and solid earth. Eventually, they gave up. They named it a garden. They planted flowers, trees, a small stone bench beneath a willow that never grew. They placed a hedge around the space. They posted no signs. They allowed the grass to grow long and pale. And they walked around it, always around it. Even now, Century la Terre. Those who visit the remnants of Château Sandeni speak of that strange patch of ground, how the birds avoid it, how the wind moves differently when it passes over, how no matter the season, no matter the sun, the grass is always damp. There are no monuments to the Queen, no plaque, no portrait, no stained glass window. She is not listed among the sovereigns. Her seal was melted. Her name struck from the records. Her memory was forbidden. But those who know still whisper. They say she was not killed. They say she was not cleansed. They say the fire did not destroy her. It only opened something deeper, something older. And when it did, whatever she had become stepped through, not into death, not into heaven, but into the quiet spaces that fire cannot reach. And so the Queen was not erased. She was only moved. And sometimes, when the garden is still, and the wind does not stir, and the black mark begins to shimmer in the fading light, Some say they hear the faint rustle of cloth behind the hedges, not like something being dragged, but like something standing, waiting. There comes a time, after history has finished recording what it dares to remember, and silence has swallowed what it fears to say, when the past becomes not fact nor fable but shadow. The queen who had no funeral, no burial, no epitaph, became that kind of shadow. Not just a secret, not just a shame, but an emptiness that shaped the kingdom around it, a hollow in the heart of power, where a throne once stood, and now stood alone. The monarchy continued, at least in name. But names, as the courtiers would come to learn, no longer held the weight they once did. The Queen's name had been erased, and with it, the shape of rule itself shifted. Council seats once reserved for ceremony were filled with trembling hands. Heirs squabbled in private. Nobles forged bloodlines in the dark. And each family feared the quiet the most, not the chaos of a collapsing court, but the stillness that always came before something returned, because they did not bury her. And something that is not buried is not finished. In the capital, the churches remained silent on the matter. The archbishop's successor, chosen from among the quietest of monks, forbade the mention of her reign. He wrote a single line in his revised record of sovereigns. The throne passed during the days of silence. Beneath it, no seal, no date, no name, but people remembered, not in words, in dreams. The laundress who'd once worked 3 halls from the Queen's chamber began waking each night with blisters on her fingertips, as though from touching boiling water. A clerk who copied ledgers by hand began drawing spirals in the margins of every page, tight spirals that began to look like something with eyes. A child born to a midwife's daughter would not stop humming. Not a song, not a lullaby, just one note, over and over, softly, gently, until the floorboards beneath her cradle began to warp. The city never rebuilt the eastern wing. They let the weeds grow. They let the wind claim the empty foundation. A wall was raised, not high, not grand, just enough to mark a line. On the map, it was listed as common ground, but no one passed through it. And by royal decree, no building, no home, no chapel, no stable could be constructed on that earth. It was called La Terra Vide, the empty land, and in time, those who ruled sat not as sovereigns, but as stewards. They made no proclamations without counsel. They chose their words carefully. They lit candles before entering certain halls, and when the light flickered, they waited before speaking, because they knew, though the Queen had no name, her absence held shape. Though her throne was stripped, her echo remained, and the kingdom, once ruled by lineage and blood, now ruled by memory and caution. The new sovereign who would never wear a crown, only a ring, refused to sit upon the original throne. He had one carved anew, plain, ash wood, no engravings. He placed the original behind a velvet curtain, and some nights he swore he could hear something breathing behind it. Not a voice, not a presence, but that same stuttering breath they once heard through the door of the Queen's chamber. The curse, if one still called it that, had never promised destruction. It had promised transformation. And so, the kingdom transformed. Priests began blessing stairwells. Midwives carried salt on their belts. The royal calendar skipped 3 days in winter. No one sang lullaby past dusk. And though the Queen's name had been forgotten by law, her story survived in shadow. Not written, not spoken, but carried, like cold breath in a closed room, like mold beneath painted walls, like the faint wet print of bare feet across stone long after the rain has ended. And in every generation that followed, one child would ask, who was the Queen before the one who rules now? And the answer was always the same. There was no queen then, but the child would sometimes wake screaming, and sometimes they would remember things they had never been told. They would draw a room they had never seen. They would hum a tune no one had sung. And sometimes they would speak a name no one remembered teaching them. A name with no sound, no shape, only a feeling, like black silk sliding across a wooden floor. Like a breath that does not belong to the body, it leaves like the memory of something still watching from the other side of the door. So ends the tale of the queen who bore a child of decay, and whose own flesh became a temple to the silence that followed. She was never buried. She was never named. But in the space she left behind, the kingdom learned what it meant to fear not death, but what walks beyond it. Sleep now, and let no dreams enter. Some shadows do not wait to be remembered. They are already listening.